looking over this entire semester at racial justice issues. And I'm just delighted to be able to have these two distinguished guest speakers and presenters with us, Dr. Andrea Douglas and Dr. Kirt van Daake. They're going to be talking to Stumbling Toward Repair, UVA, Charlottesville, and the process of coming to terms with the past and creating equity in the present. Both of our speakers who function as the co-chairs for the current commission by the UVA on the university and the age of segregation have worked tirelessly and given leadership to a number of commissions, which they'll talk about a little bit more. They have been tireless proponents of truth-telling, racial justice, and efforts at reparations. And so it's a delight to have both of them with us. Let me introduce them briefly before we go into their presentation. Dr. Andrea Douglas is the Executive Director of the Jefferson School African American Heritage Center in Charlottesville. She previously served as a curator of collections and exhibitions and a curator of contemporary art at the University of Virginia Art Museum. She has been a chair of the Charlottesville's Place Design Task Force, a member of the Blue Ribbon Commission on Race and Monuments, and UVA's President's Commission on Slavery at the university, the commission that preceded this current one that we'll be discussing. Douglas was recently featured in the Virginia Museum of History and Culture exhibition, Agents of Change, Female Activism in Virginia, from Women's Suffrage to Today. She received her MA and PhD in Art History from the University of Virginia and an MBA in Arts Management and Finance from Binghamton University, New York. Welcome, Andrea. It's a delight to have you with us. Dr. Kirt van Daake is a historian, assistant dean, and professor of the College at Arts and Sciences at the University of Virginia. He co-chairs with Dr. Douglas both the UVA's President's Commission on Slavery and the UVA President's Commission on the University in the Age of Segregation. His first book, Freedom Has a Face, Race, Identity, and Community in Jefferson, Virginia, came out in 2012. He also co-authored both the 2018 President's Commission on Slavery report, which I highly recommend to you, and the 2019 volume, Educated in Tyranny, Slavery at Thomas Jefferson's University. Since 2016, he has been the managing director of Universities Studying Slavery, a UVA-led consortium of over 70 schools of higher education in 5 different countries. And I can attest to his tireless leadership in that effort and a lot of plates spinning, but that association has had some really meaningful and I believe critical conversations around the role of universities in taking responsibility or in this country for the racial violence of our past, as well as looking at ways in which we can consider repair for the future. So it's a delight to have both of you, as I've said before, and I'm going to turn it over to you for your presentation. And we look forward to your presentation, and after that, a time of engagement through Q&A. And let me remind folks, please use the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen for questions, and we will pass those on to our presenters once they've finished their formal presentation. Kirt?
Getting ready to share my screen here. It's still not allowing me to share my screen. Sorry for the delay. I'm not able to share the screen yet. Okay, we are in business. Thank you everyone for tuning in. I just wanted to start with a brief comment about the work that we've been doing. The two commissions at UVA that we're going to talk about in the process have been entirely driven by the University of Virginia's desire to come to terms with its past involvement in enslavement of human beings up to 1865, and then in anti-Black racism after 1865. So there is most certainly much more work to be done in terms of UVA and Virginia's complicated history beyond this.
Okay. So what the quote that we have here is a quote by Isabella Gibbons from 1867. And she is a pivotal figure in the story because she really straddles the two sites that we are discussing tonight, both in terms of what one thinks about past history in terms of the university's history, and then present history in terms of a community history. So I'm not going to read it completely, but there's some things in it that are important for us to sort of consume in this, because what she really is doing is giving us a really clear sense of what it was like to be enslaved in Charlottesville. She describes the kind of terror that's involved, the whipping post, the cowhide, the whip, handcuffs, dogs, the spaniels. And so a really telling quote for us in thinking about this. She also makes another quote that we don't have here, that why I believe her to be pivotal, because she is also a woman then leaves enslavement and becomes the first educator, Black educator at the Jefferson School. And she also then in her utterances makes statements about what freedom is like. And one of the things she says, just very boldly, it's so much better to be free. So, you know, a very iconic person, very important in the dialogue and the history that we're going to talk about. And so I'm going to turn it over to Kirt, and then he and I are just going to sort of go back and forth with each other as we go through.
So I'm a historian. I can't help but give a brief history lecture. I'm going to try to move through this really quickly because not all of you may know the context. And I love to start with this image, which captures the cultish quality of UVA for 200 years. If you look closely at the image, you'll see that it is perfectly sunny, 77 degrees, and pleasant on the lawn with the rotunda in the distance. To the right, metaphorically over Richmond or Charlottesville, are storm clouds where trouble brews. There's a rainbow beaming into a garden behind one of the pavilions on that right-hand side of the drawing. And then to the left, there are beams of sunshine coming down from the heavens. I'm sure there's a unicorn and an angel blowing a trumpet somewhere in those clouds. And this speaks to the political image the university was producing about itself, and in some way reflects some of the kind of cult imagery of UVA today. So our job has been to kind of pick at those threads and see what's really hidden in plain sight throughout that. And we're looking at getting at an intellectual genealogy around white supremacy and anti-Black racism in the university's history. And so what have we learned? An important piece to consider here is that this is the flagship university in the largest and most important slaveholding state in the United States, right? This is a state where 40% of the population is held in human bondage, and the university is founded in a county where over half of the population up to 1865 is held in bondage. So it's an area of relative concentrated slaveholding. We shouldn't be surprised what comes next. It's also a university that was founded by Thomas Jefferson, right? The third president of the United States, a founding father, the author of the Declaration of Independence, the author of the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom, and by some accounts, a man who was, at least on paper, dedicated to ending slavery. At UVA, we talk about him as the founder of the university and a lover of freedom, but he was also a man who evinced a lifelong commitment to human bondage. He enslaved 607 people over the course of his life, and in many of his writings opining about the horror of slavery, he also evinced what we would describe as a white supremacist understanding and ideas about race. And his ideas are not responsible for what happens, right? The university opens in 1825. He dies within a year, but his ideas are an animating spirit that embodies the next 150 years or so of the university's existence as a center of education and research. So he's the intellectual godfather of all that follows that we'll be talking about today. So we did the research. Again, this is a research project to understand slavery at the university. That was the goal. We found out that the university enslaved 4,000 people at some point between 1817 and 1865. And that's an approximate number. It could have been higher. Some of the people that are in that count were perhaps only working at the university for a day or two, but this is a lot of people. At any given point between about 1825 and 1865, you can assume that there were at least 100 enslaved people living and working at the university at that moment, possibly closer to 200. Again, we can't fully quantify the numbers. This is a site of concentrated enslavement, much like this, the state. And as you can see from the image in the background, we were able to recover some names. And so part of the goal was to recover their stories, talk about their existence, and try to recover some of that humanity as best we could, working from the records of the enslavers. So that's a key, and that's where Isabella Gibbons is really important, that we actually have her words, where most of the names you see there, we have one entry in a financial ledger and not much more. Our project also really covered this idea of pro-slavery thought, right? Jefferson saw slavery as evil, but never worked to get rid of it. The university by the 1830s is very clearly an incubator for pro-slavery thought. So professors talk about it in the classroom. Students debate it in debate halls. Alumni come and lecture about it. Alumni leave the university and spread across, mostly across the South, taking their ideas with them. As early as 1850, university students are calling for secession because they're worried about Northerners trying to limit slavery or take away their sacred property. So it's deeply embedded in the educational experience at the university up to 1865. And then the war happens. Nearly every student at the university in 1861 leaves to join the Confederate war effort. Many alumni do. 7 of 16 Confederate cabinet members were UVA alums. We were represented in nearly every state house of the states that seceded and joined the Confederacy. And when they returned in 1865, they had lost on the battlefield, but were unmollified about their ideas about white supremacy and the natural human, what they saw as a natural human order. And so they returned and quickly embraced the lost cause, the phrase, the lost cause, this post-war explanation explaining Southern defeat, but also claiming that they were correct, is coined by a UVA alum in 1866. So we articulate the idea of the lost cause and then commit as an institution, this is professors, students, and alums, to a vision of the world where white supremacy is natural and that any idea of Black citizenship and civilization is not real, right? That the African-American people are incapable of citizenship in this view. So this is important to shaping the intellectual genealogy here.
And in shaping the intellectual genealogy, and it also is important in also shaping the ways in which the university and its students react to the African-American population that is now free and is moving around and beginning to sort of attempt to create their own sense of progress. By the time you get to 1870, we know that one of the first deeds of property is signed for land signed by John West, who in fact is the son of Isabella Gibbons, who does not grow up with Isabella Gibbons, but does grow up with with Nancy West, a free Black woman living on the downtown mall. And so as we begin to sort of see and trace an African-American moment between the 1870s and certainly well into the late 1890s, just before the turn of the century and the really 1902 Constitution that changes everything in terms of Reconstruction gains, you begin to really also see this white backlash against this kind of prosperity and the necessary white rage. I like to, we spend a little time with primary documents. So this is a letter from a quote from a letter that was written on July 14th, 1898, which should give you just a little bit of a sense of what the tenor of that actual rage sounds like 30 years after emancipation. The letter was written by a woman who's writing to her husband, who is describing the lynching of John Henry James, who was a member of the community, who was known to have been selling ice cream, who had been thought to have raped a woman, molested a white woman in front of her home. But this quote said, this act was done not by a tramp, but by one of those whom we'd been taxed to educate. They killed him too quick. They ought to have dragged him up and down the street as an example, as a fine taste of what we had for the balance. So just kind of giving you an idea of the level of sort of vitriol associated with Black freedom. And this is all against the backdrop of a community that's beginning to grow. As I said, they're buying property, they're establishing themselves. They've created the Jefferson School, where they're all being educated. The first teacher that comes into Charlottesville describes the founding of the school. She says, let a school be open and scholars will come from age 6 to 60. So we know the African-American community believe wholeheartedly in the importance of education and as a move towards enfranchisement. So the notion of rage, we also see documents from the university going back a little earlier to 1890. There was an article published in the university newspaper that talks about UVA students participating in mob violence in a near lynching of a Black man who allegedly had killed a police officer. His name was William Muskow. They did not actually complete the lynching. Muskow was in fact tried and hung, but this idea that mob violence as a form of retribution was very much apparent in the community and fueled in some part, again, as Kirt was describing, by the sort of racial narrative of African-American people being of a lesser order, developed first with Jefferson and then into other important people such as James Cabell, Paul Barringer, and ultimately Alderman, who is president of the university for some 24 years. And this, the kind of language that's being used is the kind of language that talks about African-American people as savage. This notion that as a consequence of being freed, they revert themselves back to their savage nature. That enslavement had allowed enslavers to create a fine-tuned Black specimen. And then as they moved out of enslavement, they revert back to the savagery. And so this nature of savagery is that which has to be controlled. It is that which has to be feared. That is, even in the case of moments where you can point to real prosperity, even that prosperity is defined in some way as chicanery. We see in some of the documents, descriptions of Black communities being described as rookery, places that need to be removed from the public sphere and displaced in that kind of way. And you see this, this language in print, certainly at the university. You're seeing it in the yearbooks, the university's yearbooks, Corks and Curls. There is a litany of images of minstrelsy. There's a litany of images of Sambo figures. And even related to, these images are related to our imaging things that they are not necessarily even representative of. There's some sort of very clear obsession with the denigration of the Black body as image, and creating these visual spaces where that body the idea of savagery can be maintained. So, you know, as we're seeing in this image here, the wide lips, those kinds of motifs are carried through over and over and over in the pages of Corks and Curls, largely state pages. You know, they're the openings to, at the school in the yearbooks, there were pages associated with students and faculty who were from particular areas of the country. And as you open that state page, there is an image of a Black person, largely depicted in that generalized Sambo space. So this dehumanization and notion of what Blackness looks like is articulated, and it comes out of this definitive movement towards a racial ideology that wants to separate what we understand whiteness to be and what we understand Blackness to be. And it's always towards this notion of whiteness as pure. So that even while you reach this space of into the 1920s, when you're thinking about, you know, things like the Racial Integrity Act, you're thinking about the idea of the Anglo-Saxon Club in the 1920s. These are all organizations and then policies that are derived directly from the intervention of UVA faculty. And in the case of certainly the Anglo-Saxon Club, where you're talking about John Powell, who was a professor of music. He was one of the founders of the Anglo-Saxon Club in 1922. His ideology is coming out of what he has learned as a student at the University of Virginia. So, Kirt?
And Andrea has already addressed this a little bit with the mentioning of lynching, but there's also a late 19th and into the 20th century commitment to racial terror, right? This is the second Klan is reborn around 1915. We know at UVA, at least a decade earlier, there are, it's not clear that it's a Klan cell, but there are Klan activities at UVA in Klan costume. And by the 1920s, there's one Klan cell that's affiliated with the University of Virginia and pledges money to the Centennial Fund. So there are two Klan cells in Charlottesville, one of which has its founding at a midnight ceremony at Thomas Jefferson's grave, right back to this intellectual genealogy. They were claiming it as theirs. They burn crosses all over Charlottesville and Albemarle County. And this is part of this commitment to racial terror to maintain white rule at that time.
And just, oh, sorry, Kirt, go ahead. No, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. And with this, and this is, I believe that's John Powell at a piano here in the image here. Andrea mentioned the Anglo-Saxon clubs, right? This is a scientific Klan, right? This is a public eugenics organization that's committed to a pseudo-scientific explanation for white rule and wants to police whiteness in powerful ways, right? And that's consonant with what's going on at UVA. There is a commitment starting in 1904 with Edwin Alderman, who comes in as the first president of the university, to building a modern university that in all of its disciplines is committed to kind of thinking about this Southern progressive idea of order and efficiency, and with that is an assumption of white supremacy. So the eugenics program, it becomes one of the leading eugenics programs in the country, multiple professors teaching it. It is taught at UVA into the 1950s. And much of this, these ideas coming out of social science programs, coming out of the science programs, right, actually go on as they leave UVA to shape public policy in Virginia, in the nation, and even beyond. So there's a powerful story spilling out of this anti-black racist pedagogical moment at UVA that has implications that this commission hasn't even touched upon yet. So really important that this work is going on in the classroom and in the research laboratories, and is often using local African-American communities as subjects to prove the very assumptions they have about white supremacy.
Yeah,
So,
Kirt,
go
just
ahead,
me
sorry.
add, I'm sorry, I just wanted to add this one part to it. When Kirt talks about this idea that it's filtering down, one of the main ways that it's filtering down is in education. The superintendent of Charlottesville schools beginning in 1907 is James Johnson. And he is a UVA grad. He's coming out of the education school. He is a firm believer in Southern progressive education and this notion of order. And one of the things that he says is, in his own reflective in the building projects, is that he wants all of the ideals of Jeffersonian ideals to trickle down into the community. And he starts a building project that begins in 1916 with the first white elementary school, McGuffey, and continues through into 1934 with the last school, which is Lane High School. And so the ideology even stretches into how we look at our educational spaces and the structure in which the curriculums are created and articulated. What kinds of teaching programs. We know that there was a teaching program of African-American teachers in 1908. And so really sort of trying to filter down into the community these ideals and policy processes.
So that's what we've learned about this history. And again, this gets us firmly into the 1950s or 1960s, even in our short version. And I want to pivot now to what had the university done to acknowledge any of this prior to the work we're doing now? It hadn't. And I will start here with, if you came to the university up to 2006, this is really one of the only things you would have found anywhere at the university that would have even hinted at this past. And what's really key here is this is on a serpentine wall on one of the gardens. This is right near Hotel A. So if you're by the chapel or Alderman Library, this was on a wall since 1952. It was replaced earlier this year. So it has finally been changed. But this speaks to the cult image I was talking about, that no acknowledgement of the 4,000 enslaved people. And in fact, right, saying that Jefferson built the walls himself. That's kind of where our acknowledgement was, non-existent in 2006. In 2007, as part of the Virginia 400-year anniversary, the Board of Visitors followed the General Assembly in issuing a statement of profound regret for slavery, and then installed this plaque that you can make out sideways here in the ground in an underground walkway on the south side of the rotunda. So you'd have to stop in an archway, turn perpendicular to traffic, look down and read the threshold. And its acknowledgement of slavery is in honor of the several hundred women and men, both free and enslaved, whose labor between 1817 and 1826 helped to realize Thomas Jefferson's design for the university. You notice the shadow of one man looms large over our work. So that's where we were when our first commission started. This was really the state of acknowledgement of this history at UVA. So we have attempted to dive in to do something, I think, a lot more elaborate in terms of telling this history and not making it just a UVA project. So our process, we're not a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, but neither commission is, but we were informed by restorative and reparative justice models as ways to think about how we might do this. So we worked to do a good research project on each, on anti-Black racism in the age of segregation and on slavery, and then do public acknowledgement of the findings, try to make those records as accessible as possible. And then as we were thinking through what we were doing, be open and transparent. Here's what we're doing. We're going to bring it to you in the community, let you hear about it, and then listen to you and use what you tell us to sort of change what we're doing. We worked very hard. We're an educational institution. We think education is really important. This is educate our current students. This is educate our alumni. This is work with K through 12 programs to help them think about how they can use this history in the classroom. And then we lump this under education, but it's do truth telling in communities that already know this history. In Charlottesville, in many corners of Charlottesville, UVA is often referred to as the plantation or the big plantation. And so this wasn't educating, it was going out and doing the truth telling, holding talks in the public to an audience that already knew the broad contours of this history. And so that's been really important to us. And we've tried to be inclusive in this work, that as people attend our meetings and want to participate in this project of coming to terms with anti-Black racism and slavery, that they were welcome to participate and join in our working groups and the work. So we've tried to make it a big tent. We've tried to be intentional and coordinated in how we've approached what we were doing. So it's taking that community feedback and then structuring an approach that works on several fronts simultaneously. And the mantra has always been, right, acknowledge this past, engage with the community about it, atone for it, and educate.
And I think what we want to also emphasize here is that, you know, from the very first commission in 2013 to where we are today, this has been an 8-year-long process. And so we've learned a lot as a consequence of how we engage and with whom we engage. I wanted to just sort of reiterate what Kirt said about this idea of Charlottesville already knowing this history. And one of the things that you have to come into real terms with is the idea that while on the one hand, the university believes it's doing work, the community has been already doing its own work, its own genealogical research into its own histories. This idea of engaging descendants of the university means, in fact, you are engaging the community. There are enough people in Charlottesville, and I think, Kirt, we've identified almost 100 families or so that live in Charlottesville and have been living in Charlottesville since the moment of emancipation, who have been working themselves on their own history. So there's a place in this narrative where it has to be very clear that when you're doing this work, it is not a one-sided conversation, that this is really a conversation that is about a partnership, and that it really cannot move forward without a partnership. And the idea, so this notion of connecting with community and connecting with descendants really, in my mind, means, and I think is part of what the success of this project to this point means, it means that you respect that you are not doing university work, that you have a partner out in the community that is as proactive and has ownership of the stories that you're trying to tell from their perspective, right? There's always two sides to every coin. So the step one, connecting with community and descendants, having a place like the African American Heritage Center where that can be done, was beneficial to the process because it's where the community would feel most comfortable. So meeting people where they are as opposed to trying to cause people to come to you was, I think, one of the key understandings in that, and creating a community-based commission as well, so that you're not just all university faculty, but that your notion of expertise comes from both directions, is very important in there, especially as you're focusing on this Black history, or history of Black people in this community.
Which is a perfect segue to.
So, this image, if you wanted to just get a sense of what it looks like, who the people we're talking about as we're moving forward, this image is the image from 1867 of the first graduating class of the Jefferson School. And so when you can speak to this idea that number one, Isabella Gibbons has a voice in this process, because she was being paid by the Freedmen's Aid Society, and had to give monthly reports. These people, the African-American community that we are talking about, they also have an image. There's a body here. And so when we're talking about community and descendants, even in looking at an image such as this is exactly the quintessential descriptor of what that means. Every one of these people has some relationship either to the university, certainly, that we can point out, either as being descendant of Monticello, either descendant of workers at the university in some way. And so both at the university, highlighting opportunities to tell that story. And part of that process had been, wherever you could tell the story. So if you were going to build a new building, for instance, you would then create an opportunity to create significant exhibition for students to engage in. In the rotunda, there is significant exhibition for visitors to engage in, finding ways to make sure that at every point as people are moving around the landscape of the university, that they are engaging in some kind of language, and that, or descriptor. And that's a really interesting thing, because as Kirt pointed out, looking at all of the plaques from 2007, in 2011, the university erected on the South Lawn a monument of a sort to a free Black woman, Kitty Foster. And so that was in 2011. And then we talk about the exhibitions over in Gibbons Hall. That's another opportunity. Then also at the Rotunda, yet another opportunity. So really sort of not reinserting, but uplifting these narratives of people who within the spaces that they also occupied. So and beginning to start to center them, as opposed to only centering the work of faculty or of white students, but now you begin to see this capacity. And for someplace like the Heritage Center, being able to draw that history into the community space as well. That's also part, I think, of the project of transparency as we move forward, to really create that direct link, one between the other within the space of these bodies. Great.
Okay, we've covered a little bit of this, but I want to come back once more. The education piece was really important, and we looked at this multiple ways. We put on 2 major conferences to bring in people and communities. So it wasn't just scholars, it was scholars, historic preservationists, genealogists, descendants, activists, to have conversations about how do you come to terms with slavery and anti-Black racism in institutional histories, historic sites, everybody involved. We thought this was really, it was part of our charge, and we think it's really important. And the consortium we started, University Studying Slavery, now does 2 of these a year, committed to looking at slavery and racism in institutional past. We also felt that you have to reach the heart in some way. And we looked at meaningful rituals of remembrance as ways to bring the community in and have kind of a collective reckoning with this past in ways that weren't, say me or Andrea lecturing, which I think been really, really important to do all of this work all the time and keep this conversation going. And then at UVA, and Andrea's referenced a bit to this, we wanted to make this history visible at UVA. We still have a lot of work to do here, but we've come a long way from those 2006 and 2007 plaques. And I've come back to the cult drawing because it, in fact, tells us very clearly that this history isn't hidden. It has always been here if you just were looking for it. And so in the image you see here, in plain sight, is an enslaved woman on a balcony holding a professor's child, right? The story's always been there. We just had to make a decision that we were going to acknowledge it and acknowledge the humanity of the people in those images. So I think this is a really powerful reminder that it's really about telling a whole story, telling the truth, and using that as a groundwork, maybe to get to the title of our talk, which is sort of that question about repair. So it's always been there. The first commission on slavery ended with, and it's behind me in my little box, a memorial to enslaved people. This is the largest memorial to enslaved people at any university on earth. And UVA is rightly proud of it, but it's a beginning, not an end, right? This is the culmination of that first commission's process, but it's a permanent statement in the ground and on the ground about the value of a community project. Its location, its design is entirely the product of a years-long, 5 years of commission work engaging with the community and nearly 2 years of the design team engaging with the community. And it's meant to be in conversation with the UVA landscape. It's meant to be visible and accessible to the community. Our first community event at the Jefferson School in 2014, the first community member to get up and speak said, the question was basically, what are we gonna do? What should we do? You better darn well build a memorial. It better be big, it better be visible, and we better be able to get to it. And so I think this is really important to doing that work and creating a space that demands that passersby pull into it and stop and reflect. And it's kind of lived on in that way. And it's meant to acknowledge humanity. So it has a memory wall upon which are inscribed the names of the enslaved people we were able to pull from the records. It also acknowledges skill and occupation and family and community. And to give you an idea, I opened with 4,000 or more. We only have about 560 names on the memorial, right? That the records of the enslavers were never meant to highlight the humanity and do this. And so this is the unforgetting that needed to happen in the white community and at the predominantly white university. Andrea?
Yeah. So I think, as we begin to start to think about, where we are now, one of the things that we want to emphasize is, and I spoke to it a little bit before, but when you take on a project such as this, and you really have to start to ask yourself the question, how do you create that space of trust? How do you bring people into a conversation where they have at some point, Kirt mentioned this notion of it being the plantation. The outcome of that idea is that you're asking people to engage in a process where they have to believe that you are authentic, that they can trust that your outcomes are such. And what I have found to be most important about this is that for every time we went out into the community and asked an opinion, there was a responsive action thereafter. And something that someone could point to, that their commentary or their discourse was revealed in that action. And I think that is one of the things that one can look at this particular monument for as well, because as Kirt said, there was commentary and there was a discussion about what really does this object do to describe enslavement. Certainly it's elegant, certainly it has names on it. But in one of those very same conversations, people said, for instance, we don't see the body in this. We don't feel the physicality of that very, very deleterious terror, the fact of enslavement. And so ultimately, on the outside of the monument are Isabella Gibbons' eyes. And again, she is the thread that we sort of carry through in this narrative that we're trying to write, beginning in as an enslaved person and then ending her life as a free person. So I think that as we, begin to articulate what are the things that have kind of bubbled to the top, it's this clear need of trust, this clear need to respect that although it is a university story, it does not belong solely to the university, and that those people whose story it is must maintain ownership of what happens to their story. It is that way that as a means of repair, you're sort of engaging and giving back the right to articulate your own narrative in spaces where Black people's narratives had not had ownership of that. The description of them as lower beings suggests that they did not have ownership of that. And so we understand very clearly that there's more work to do. We understand very clearly that that the university has to commit resources to maintaining this process, to taking this process to a place where we can actually understand what equity looks like. The university has created an equity center, and the equity center is committed to taking the recommendations of both commissions to this point and trying to actualize those commissions by giving funding to particular projects, for instance, that members of the community are most interested in. Up until this point, and certainly I have to say, in 2013, for instance, when the Heritage Center was created, it was created largely because Charlottesville's African-American community felt that they were not seeing themselves represented in any form in a community where at that point they were 20% of that community, the largest, after the majority community, the largest population. And so really sort of trying to create a space where the university takes ownership of the possibility of helping to actualize some of the space of action and activity for people to do their own repair, people who best understand what that looks like. And I think that is something that we learned over the course of the last 8 years in doing this work, that this, when I say this is a partnership, it has to really be that in language and in action. It has to be visible in all ways too. I refer to that 2011 monument. One of the reasons why many people don't know about it is it's not as visible as it ought to be. This monument to enslaved laborers is placed in a space that is accessible as much as it is historic. And so we understand there is a lot of work left to do. The commission in the Age of Segregation is continuing largely as a commission that is doing the research to continue to uncover the racial harm. All that we have described to you to this point is as a consequence of research that we've done most recently to understand. We're still at the place where we're amassing some of this documentation that we have acquired. And out of that, we'll move forward with additional action. But we know that we're not anywhere near the end of this. But we also know that we've been given a moment, and we have to be very active in that moment because we live in a society where things move on, people move on. And so I think we all have a sense of urgency around the work that we have to do. as we move towards trying to decide what does repair actually mean? What does reparations even mean within our own context? And how do we create the space where people feel comfortable with those ideas? I think those are the things that when we're thinking about the work of this new commission that we're grappling with.
And I'll just end. I think our work over 8 years has been really important. And we called this Stumbling Towards Repair because we've done symbolic repair, but we've not really done much of the committing of resources. And this is all the universities doing this. There is really only one that has effectively committed to a repair program, and it's not an institution in the United States. The University of Glasgow, after doing its research project and tracing the money that built and maintained the school from the Atlantic slave trade, basically to the present, committed and figured out what that was worth, committed $20 million over 10 years to a repair project with the University of the West Indies. US schools, all the commissions like ours that do this work are very interested in repair and equity in the present, but they're often not really the institutional mechanisms that can achieve it. So they talk about it a lot. Andrea, I'm remembering in 2013, we started with a heated discussion that went on for months about should we start by tackling the living wage? And the answer is yes, in a way, but we decided that you had to do the acknowledgement and the atonement and the community engagement to get to the point where the institution might move on this. And UVA, again, imperfectly and haltingly and stumblingly, is now doing some of this work. And some of that is not the direct result of our efforts, but certainly we tilled the land and built the foundation on which that work could come. And Andrea and I speak to you today as the representative, right, of two commissions that total about 50 people who are named and on the commission, and then another 50 people who served on advisory boards, and probably another 100 people who are active participants at any one moment. So know that there's a real big we in the work we do. And again, I think this work has been successful as far as it's gone, and we'll stop and we'd love to take questions.
Thank you so much, Andrea and Kirt. Really appreciate this informative, challenging, inspiring presentation, and thank you for the work that you have given your time and attention to, and your passion to. We appreciate it. There are some questions flowing in, and encourage folks who have questions brewing to feel free to put them in the Q&A. I'm going to, for the sake of hearing as many voices, I'm going to take them in somewhat of an order in which they came in, but also limit it to one question from each person that I see here in the box, or comments to persons. First of all, we have the question, and an understandable question in the broadest sense of the word, from Anthony Lopez, in the sense of there was obviously many populations that were segregated from white and who were oppressed under white supremacy, including most notably the Native American populations who suffered genocide and cultural genocide and erasure throughout the very beginnings of this, from the very beginnings of this country's history. The question, in a broader sense from Anthony, a number of questions, is how would you imagine this conversation going forward, and shouldn't that be included in the broad umbrella of this commission, which has the term of Universities in the Age of Segregation? So I wonder if either or both of you would like to make a comment in that regard, and the challenge of the mandate of this particular commission in including a multitude of voices.
Sure. First, we were handed a commission and a charge, so that wasn't ours to decide. Second, The University and the Age of Segregation Commission came about in the wake of August 11th and 12th. So this was directly about this history of anti-Black racism. And that's the burning community question that needed to be addressed here. That doesn't mean there shouldn't be more work done elsewhere, but we were charged very explicitly with this one thing. And it's a pretty massive undertaking all on its own. And I alluded to this earlier. There's lots of other stories about marginalized populations at the university that were impacted by ideas at the university that we still need to come to terms with, right? We are still at the beginning of this long process, but we were charged with slavery and then the post-1865 era of anti-Black racism, and that's what we have focused on.
And I think too that in so doing, one of the things that what we're able to do is really sort of articulate what the broad strokes of that could look like, right? And so when you're thinking about what it means to differentiate whiteness, which was essentially the project of white supremacy, was to make sure that there would be a pure space for whiteness, unencumbered by anything else. You begin to start to see what the patterns are, what the discourse looks like. And in so doing allows you for an open space to apply that information. So I think that even as one begins to start to think about the predominance of information that we have at the university and where that information directs you, certainly it allows you, once you've sort of embraced all of that, to make to move further out into other spaces. But I don't think that in making the decisions about how we're going through our process, we are negating in any way a conversation that is not applicable in other places.
Thank you. Here's a comment by Janet Kilby, I think just as in some ways almost a truth-telling, a historical moment. Janet says, my father graduated from UVA Medical School in 1933. He had studied under Professor of Eugenics, Dr. H.E. Jordan. He brought the racism that was confirmed by quote unquote science to his medical practice in Baltimore, Maryland, where his medical office and separate waiting rooms for whites and colored, quote unquote. I saw this as a little girl. My father's racism was passed to me. I'm not alone to having been taught racism by a UVA graduate. I will always have this in me and will always struggle to expunge it. My father's family also enslaved people. I have connected with the descendants of those persons through a project that spun out from, or that was germinated in CJP called Coming to the Table. We've done a webinar on that. These kinds of connections are important, as you say. So Janet simply confirming much of what you were speaking on. Carson here asked a question: how does the intellectual genealogy include the understanding of European society and structure prior to Europeans coming to the North American landscape?
That's a great question. I don't know that I have a perfect answer to it, right? That built into this intellectual genealogy has, right, there's a sort of fictive Anglo-Saxon culture that is created, that's mythical, that doesn't exist. And then it's tied in with a very weird American exceptionalism. So I don't know that that I have a coherent answer for what that piece of the intellectual genealogy looks like, other than to say, in terms of, you see this most profoundly in Virginia and in America in the early 20th century, and this area is no exception, that there's an understanding about right, white people in America being the descendants of this proud imagined European tradition that's carrying civilization across the globe and pushing savagery out of the way and making useful use of the land as they go, right? So there's a whole myth about the frontier that's really popular in the early 20th century, that is often deployed as part of this white supremacist project that has as its background this mythical Anglo-Saxon imagined past. There's a great book by Greg Grandin that won the Pulitzer this year that looks at the metaphors of the frontier and the border that I think does a great job talking about this. I don't have the name in front of me, but Greg Grandin won the Pulitzer Prize.
We have a question coming in from Jim, and I'm welcoming others as we go. Jim Husmer, how are all incoming students strongly presented with the truth of the racist past to the future of this institution to which they are tying themselves?
Yeah, this is the million-dollar question that we've wrestled with. We built a curriculum. It is not built into orientation and kind of onboarding of students. This is a university that for 200 years has had an elective curriculum. And so it's very hard to create mandatory courses that you force students to take. And we're still wrestling with how to do this. We are looking at incentivizing departments to build classes that do this. So we sort of lard the curriculum with them. I'm working with a group of students right now who are working on first-year dorm projects. So kind of meaningful rituals of remembrance that can happen in the dorms. This is one of the things we've wrestled with. It's really hard to inject this into the kind of onboarding of students. And you run the risk that when you're doing this, right, when you make it a mandatory piece, you often sort of inadvertently trivialize it to the very people who most need to hear the story. So we've really struggled with how to do that. What we have worked with, they didn't need our help. We have an entirely student-run group called the University Guides here, who do all the historical tours. And they have really leaned into telling UVA's history in all of its kind of guts and glory on their tours now. They talk about slavery, they talk about racism, they talk about the pioneer generations of African-American students, they talk about the battle for co-education. So if you go on a historical tour, you'll hear that really loudly and clearly. They're working on how do you pull that into an admissions tour. We're not there yet. We also built, we stole this from Andrea Douglas and the Jefferson School. We built a walking tour map. And I think this is good news that when you come to visit the university, most people end up in the rotunda. They do the little visitor center museum there, and they pick up a map. And it leads you around the university. It leads you to the memorial. If you do the whole walk, it's over a 5-mile loop, but it takes you to sites and introduces you to the history. It's now an app that you can download for free from the library. So if you pick up the map, you can scan the app. Again, these are all imperfect ways of capturing people's attention and making it part of the story, but it's a start. We also run a summer camp for high school students. And the goal here was, our problem is we can't build a class that 20,000 students are gonna take. And we want them to learn it right at the moment they enter or before, because if you wait for them to take the class, they might not be there till the 3rd or 4th year. And this is almost too late to, and I'm gonna steal a line from a friend at Sewanee University who leads their project, who calls it changing the ecology of the university and the campus. And that's been one of our goals. How do we make this story visible and part of kind of the living memory of students, and one that future generations of students see as important? And I think we're getting closer. That my sense of student activism is they want more of the kind of work we've been doing. They want to expand it, but again, imperfect. And on the map I was talking about, give you a number, pre-pandemic, over 1,000 of those maps left the rotunda every month. So even if only 1/3 of those maps were opened and partially used, we're reaching a fair number of people. But again, I think it's a great question. We have not mastered how to incorporate meaningful rituals of remembrance. I've worked with students on projects, including something at Convocation, where much like when you sign the sacred honor scroll and commit to a community of honor, you also do something that really is meaningful that brings this history of slavery and racism to the forefront and commits you to not doing it in the past, in the future. So that's all kind of still ongoing. We're not there yet.
Yeah, and also even in relationship to the monument, you know, in the thinking of the monument and trying to create that as a ritualized space. The city of Charlottesville began to commemorate Liberation and Freedom Day on March 3rd. And so that was done in 2016, I think. And from that moment forward, that has been a community and university project together. And so it's planned, when we're no longer in pandemic, that the ritual of walking from that monument down into the community is going to be sort of practiced. So again, creating this sort of physicality of action, trying to inculcate it into a culture so that it is a meaningful space, not just for a community of African-American people, but also for university students, understanding that the university was very much part of the liberation of the town. The university rector and the mayor of Charlottesville were those who surrendered to Union troops when they came in. And so really sort of making those kinds of histories apparent, and then ritual over time is another way of really trying to accomplish that.
And I just changed my background picture. This is the memorial this summer when the entire medical center, in protest of the murder of George Floyd, walked out and did a kneel-in at the memorial. Right, the memorial, as that community engaged project, was about honoring the ancestors, honoring humanity, but it was also creating a place for quiet reflection and protest. And it's doing that work now. We don't get out much in the pandemic, but in all my visits there over the fall semester, it's really fascinating to sit back and just watch casual passersby be drawn into it. And so there needs to be more of this. You can still visit the university and just kind of stumble through it and not hit any of the interpreted and evocative things we've done. But it's harder, a lot harder to do now than it was 8 years ago. And there's more in process that we're working on. So again, it takes time. Someone reminded me yesterday that if you think you're going to do one of these Truth and Reconciliation commissions, and you're going to be in and out in a year and a half with the research project, and everything's going to be fixed, and you're going to have addressed every a terrible history, it's not going to happen that way. That these take time, and often one project and the limited memorialization and truth telling leads to the next phase and to additional projects. So I'm hopeful. I tell students, don't judge it by your time at UVA, judge it by your 5 and 10 year reunion. If there's something you want now and you come back at your 10-year reunion and we're doing it, it's part of the culture, like what you started as a student really has worked. That universities are necessarily often slow moving on this, and this kind of work, it doesn't mean it's being slowed down. It just takes time to do it, and do it right, and do it fully.
Just got a comment on how powerful that photo is behind you. So thank you for touching on that. Stephen Polson asks, might you take on the question of economic reparations? It is an increasingly mainstream academic question for sociologists, particularly as it relates to discounted labor during Jim Crow.
This is a hard one, other than to say, I think I could speak for the entire commission that we've been interested in repair throughout this on a much broader scale than I think any university is willing to commit to. We don't make those decisions, right? It's way outside of our charge. So we've looked at it as, if we can get people talking about reparations and repair, and having a real conversation about it, and then make the changes that make it harder and harder to say no to even, I think the phrase Andrea used earlier, and we like to use, right? This is about committing university resources to equity in the present as a way to start to get to redress, you slowly crowd out the other possibilities. You make it harder to ignore, and you create, I hate to call it a comfort zone, but a spot where it's okay, right? What we have often found is, as you push these ideas into the public at an institution, you're immediately greeted by sort of deficit perspective and fear-based perspective. And some of our work has been acculturating people to, it's okay to talk about these difficult pasts. It's okay to have the conversation. It's okay to say it was wrong. And it's okay to say, we're going to do something about it now that may not fully repair for all of this. But I think that's really important. And if we can keep doing that, maybe we'll get there. I'm sure the person who asked the question is fully aware, right? Reparations as a concept here in the United States has been defined by its ardent enemies, right, in a way that makes it impossible to have the conversation. So if you pay attention to what schools are doing, they often use the language of reconciliation or restorative justice because they don't want to say repair. And that's a problem in the United States because we've allowed this to be defined entirely by its enemies. And I'm kind of the mind that the creative solution to this is to just shifting the conversation that maybe we need to think differently about what reparations actually looks like, because right, we get hung up on this, right, the bogeyman is this writing of checks to people. And maybe that should happen. I'm not staking a claim to that. I'm saying that seems to be when we get to that, right, we bang our heads against a wall and the conversation goes nowhere. So how do we get around that? Let's redefine what it means and what it looks like. And if the end result is resources of all kinds pouring into communities to address this, maybe we get there.
Yeah, and I also want to add to that in some ways we who think about this and are really in rarefied space, and the project up to this point has really been, you talk about it as a university project, but it really is a project of public history and public education. And we first have in this country at all, any agreement on our own histories to begin with. And so to be able to first articulate these histories so that we refute the notion of this eliding story of America as the march of great accomplishment and excellence, and start to elevate the narratives of the personal and of the people. This is, for some of us, it feels like we've been at it a long time, but I really honestly believe there's a lot more time left before we can really easily get to that conversation where we're talking about reparations as a language for all the other reasons. But I also think at the very clear heart of all of this is that this country has been undereducated about its own history for years. And that's what we've come to understand. When 2017 happened, I can't tell you how many people after 2017 told us what they didn't know about, right? What occurred this summer was, indisputable truths laid bare through video, in the same way that we can think about the civil rights movement. You kind of got to be able to consume this information. And I think as we start to think about what repair looks like, we want to monetize it. But I think you've also got to sort of really be willing to do the work of the education as an act of reparations as well, right? The fact that people have ownership of their narrative is, in fact, whether we're patient with that or not, it is an act of reparations, right? To be able to alter a long-held description of Blackness or anything non-white as less is important. And in fact, in this country, it is almost the most important thing, because we have spent easily 50 years in a project of coming out of integration into this space of where we have accepted that we have arrived, and when in fact we have not, right? Integration isn't integration, it's assimilation. And so claiming a narrative is in fact, in my point of view, also an act of reparation, right? And I think that when I think about the 8 years that I have participated in this project, bringing to light these histories and these stories, at least in our community, has opened a space where certain conversations can be had that could not ever have been had 10 years ago. I mean, I walked into Charlottesville to get an education here, and I thought I was, stepped back into Dixie when I first got here. And having never been to the South, I can decidedly say that I've seen a movement in a positive direction, or what I consider to be a positive direction.
Yeah, I think that's a powerful note there, that there has been movement, as incremental as it's been. It feels that way, and I think that's why we're able to be having this discussion to the level that we are in this country. But there's a lot more to be done, for sure. I'm looking for any other questions from our audience that may want to be. Let's see here. From I'm looking at the chat now. Also appreciate your mentioning earlier who the we is. This is from Bertha French. In the commission, there is a dynamic where Black scholarship is often overlooked and or not highlighted. Could you speak to how student activism and academics led to the creation of these commissions? It's important to speak to this work in the context of whose voices have traditionally been muted.
Oh my gosh, yes. Bertha, thank you. We didn't include all of this because otherwise we'd have kept you here for 3 hours, but it's really important. The commission didn't come out of nowhere. It came out of over really a decade of on and off student activism. As early as the early 2000s, there was a university guide who built a whole series of tours about African-American history at the university. And as soon as she graduated, it stopped. The U Guides didn't get around to kind of reinventing themselves until after another student group walked over that 2007 plaque and immediately objected to it, right? Everything about that plaque that commingled a handful of enslaved people with free workers and only had them here during construction and then made it all about Thomas Jefferson was, right, it's a failure of acknowledgement on every level. They walked over it, objected to it, and did something that I think is pretty amazing. They formed a student group called Memorial to Enslaved Laborers, and they engaged in consciousness raising activities. So this was, let's get people talking about it. So they're the predecessor to the commission, and why it's called the Memorial to Enslaved Laborers is that was their name. And this led to, in 2010, they started a design competition, not for a real memorial, for the idea of a memorial, and then crowned a winner in 2011. And they're one of the instrumental groups really creating kind of critical mass for the commission to even be founded. And again, that's 2009, 2010. That also then really inspired alumni to organize. And in 2012, an alumni group fund was created called the IDEA Fund, Inclusion, Diversity, Equity, and Access. And they began funding some of the first activities, events, and even a plaque to an enslaved man named Henry Martin that went in that same year. So that really led a drive. And it's that when you have that critical mass of student engagement, student involvement, and then alumni involvement, that really made it hard for the administration to resist doing the work, and it was really powerful. And what's neat is the students involved in that are now alums. They participated in both commissions. So right, there's a long arc of student and alumni involvement that predates our commission, but they're still with us in powerful ways. And just as an aside, this work's been going on at UVA as early as the 1990s. There's student papers in the library looking at this. The university was not willing to talk about it, but professors running research projects and having students do local history. I'm an alum of the university, and my undergraduate advisor, he's passed away, was Reginald Butler. He was the second director of the Carter G. Woodson Institute for African American Affairs here at the university. And he was committed to building kind of a local history project. And I followed him around for 3 years, and he sent me into the archives to do the work for my first book. And I'm part of a kind of a generation of students that came through UVA in the 90s that were deeply informed by work with folks at the Woodson Institute, and that kind of shaped what we did. So it's really important to know that this work deeply predates us. And I think Andrea referenced this briefly, right? There are community people who were doing this work. We know about Isabella Gibbons because of Gail Schulman, right? She was publishing in the 90s on the Gibbonses. And this is all information that wasn't part of the narrative UVA told or even wanted to talk about until a kind of a combination of students, alumni, and the community really kept this in front of everybody for a series of years. And then lastly, I'll tip my hat to my first co-chair on the Slavery Commission, Dr. Marcus Martin. He's a former chief of emergency medicine at UVA. He was instrumental in founding the Office for Diversity, what was then the Office for Diversity and Equity at UVA, and was the second chief officer for diversity and equity at the university. So that's important too, that we had his leadership in pushing then President Sullivan to create the commission. So we always stand on the shoulders of a lot of people. And to Bertha's comment, this name may not be familiar to everyone. We all stand on the shoulders of Ruth Simmons. This is the president of Brown University about 20 years ago, who had the courage and vision to say, we need to do this, right? We need to have a full reckoning with our history, and we need to think about how that impacts our present. So when we started our work in 2013, we were a decade behind Brown University, and we still stand on her wisdom, courage, and vision for how this should be done.
Thank you, Kirt. And we're gonna take a little bit of a break here just for the last few minutes to have Maggie talk to us a little bit about the work of CJP and the ZI, the Zehr Institute. However, I'd like you to hold on, and for our folks to hold on, and we'll have some final brief comments to close out this webinar under this question. The last one I have here, Louisa Davis, who says, what have you learned about what seems to make meaningful rituals of healing? And how might that be integrated in our national reckoning? I'm gonna ask you to hold that, make a few comments to that once we're through these announcements. Thank you. Maggie, over to you.
All right, thank you everyone. I do have a couple of announcements before we close. My first is just thank you for joining us for our fall series on restorative justice and anti-racism. Please visit zehr-institute.org for updates about our spring webinars. The Strategies for Trauma Awareness and Resilience, otherwise known as STAR program, is designed for individuals and organizations whose work brings them into contact with populations dealing with current or historic trauma. Currently, all STAR trainings are scheduled to meet online. Visit emu.edu/cjp/star to register for one of our upcoming spring sessions. If you're interested in learning more about restorative justice, we have several opportunities for you to study at Eastern Mennonite University through graduate degrees and certificates, such as the RJ Graduate Certificate, which is perfect for working professionals. EMU also offers studies that combine RJ and education, or RJE. Students pursuing a master's in education can get a restorative justice and education concentration, or similar to the previous slide, graduate certificates are also available for those interested in RJE. There are also master's degrees in conflict transformation, restorative justice, and the newly added program for transformational leadership. The curriculum is practice-based and ideal for individuals looking to be reflective practitioners in their chosen field. For more information, visit emu.edu/cjp/grad. Last but not least, the Zehr Institute website is available as a source for upcoming webinars, resources, and upcoming events, as well as a repository for past webinars that are linked to YouTube. The recording for tonight's webinar will be available early next week. That concludes my announcement. So back to you, Carl, and our presenters.
So any final comments from our two panelists are welcome, and then we'll close our time together. Specifically about what have we learned about some rituals of healing? What have you learned about that, and how might some of those applications be appropriate in a broader sense for our nation?
Well, Charlottesville has sort of been engaged in all of these kinds of conversations. One of the things that we did most recently was participated in that EJI Community Remembrance Project. And we picked up, we went and located the site where John Henry James had been lynched. We then 108 people got on a bus and drove to various sites along the way so that we could understand what was the relationship between that act of anti-Black terrorism and the kind of anti-Black terrorism that we live with today. And it became very clear that we were moving through a very dynamic and constant history as we got to Montgomery. And on that trip with us, we were very clear to bring in as many people as we can, and members of the university were there with us as well and participated in that process. And participated in bringing that soil to Montgomery and having it placed there. And then coming back and then articulating to the rest of the community what that experience was like. And as I think about the process that we have engaged in over the course of the last 8 years, how do you really arrive at a space of empathy? How do you get a group of people to understand that the lived experience is a communal lived experience? That, I believe, is what we're attempting to do. And have we done that completely? No. Have we created a space for experiences of communal experience? Definitely. When the Commission on Slavery created the ritual at the African-American burial site on campus that was discovered. And in many ways, a lot of this history is discovered as a consequence of construction projects, right? That the university is engaged in its change and is forced to have to stop and reckon with its past. And in so doing, has to create the process wherein more people participate in that reckoning. And with the idea, again, that this is about not talking about a white history or what white people did to Black people, but understanding that there are narratives in here that complete the story, and the telling of those narratives need to change. That as we articulate who we are, we need to understand that we have not been describing ourselves correctly because we have been in a space of omission. And so as I think about the work that we've done, as we've invaded the landscape with monuments, as we've talked about what is the implications of even putting these objects in space. I feel as if these rituals that we have created and the pattern on which universities, commissions have worked are all about trying to create a communal identity that uplifts a community. And I think that's not an easy thing to do. There's no way we can unlearn all that we believe in this country overnight. But the authentic willingness to try, the willingness to say we haven't gotten it all right yet, the willingness to say we're not done, and that we are, we believe that we have to be intentional about everything that we do, so that there are marked outcomes, you know, that they live in real time and real space. I think those are the things that at least I take away. If the commission had said, okay, we're going to study this for 100 years, then we'd be nowhere. But I think because we have been intentional in the things that we've done, so that they are apparent to people in their time, has given us a space to move from one action to the next. And I think that is the process. I think EJI has described the process in that way, calling attention to racial terror. And I think the process that we're doing is also calling attention to a racial terror of this moment and this time. And hoping that we're bringing along as many people as we can.
And
Thank you so much.
Sorry, I just want to add one other comment. I'm struck by at universities, we are stumbling toward what meaningful rituals look like, that we often need a lot of help with this. And I'm just struck by one thing we did in 2017. And so this is often look outside of your own institution to find ways to get at meaningful rituals. We brought in this Joseph McGill and the Slave Dwelling Project. And we learned this from the historic sites that we talked to and said, all right, you're now way ahead of us on telling this difficult history and trying to come to terms with it. What do we do? And Joseph McGill was one of the examples. And I think that experience of communal event of sleeping in a space that enslaved people lived in is really powerful. Like if you follow any of the historic sites, I'm thinking here particularly locally of Montpelier. And I don't know how many times the Slave Dwelling Project has visited them, but it's been a lot. And that's really rich, meaningful work that you bring in new people every time. And it's no one's lecturing. And it's that human connection that really drives this. So I'll just stop there and say, go look at all these community organizations and projects that exist outside of the universities.
Thank you both so much. We're going to need to close up. Thank you for this glimpse into your journey, specifically with UVA and its incredible work to look at transforming the historical harms of enslavement, and also for the future, and in the inspiration that you've given many of us to think about what we can do for the future. So we really appreciate it, appreciate all who were able to be with us over these 90 minutes, and all the best with your work, Kirt and Andrea. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And for those in our audience, keep your eyes on the Zehr Institute web, and we'll try to be putting up our schedule for the coming spring's webinars soon. Thank you, and have a good evening or day, wherever you may be coming in from. God bless.